Okay, so if we start with a little bit about you, who you are and what you research.
Yep. So my name is Kay Lalor. I'm a reader in human rights law at Manchester Law School, Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm also one of the co-leads for the Sylvia Pankhurst Centre for Gender and Diversity Research. Now, I'm a reader in human rights law, but my key interests are LGBT rights, sexual orientation and gender identity rights, gender and the law, and the different ways in which gender and sexuality interact with the law. I'm an editor for the journal Feminist Legal Studies. So everything that I've done my whole career has in some way dealt with issues of gender and sexuality, and usually has dealt with in some way how gender and sexuality interact with law. And the way that usually law isn't very good at interacting with gender and sexuality and isn't very good at recognizing the complexity of gender or the complexity of sexuality and sexual orientation. And I find that fascinating, and that's what I like to look at.
Well, it is very fascinating because when you look at, like, for example, because a lot of stuff about in Parliament right now where they talk about trans rights and that is like some of the conversations is what they were having about gay, lesbian, bisexual rights, like the 80s or whatever.
It very much does feel like the same kind of moral panics and sort of not quite history repeating itself, but maybe history echoing itself, and those same ideas coming back, those same constructed fears, often based on fears of the unknown or fears of what people don't understand, and that's turned too easily into condemnation. And that's very scary when those people condemning are those who are kind of holding the levers of power or the levers of influence, even if it's not kind of legal power and lawmaking power. Yeah.
So I find it fascinating as well because when they're making these laws and that, they're often quite closed-minded to possibilities, and they very fixed in their own traditional kind of ways as such, and are not really open to embracing like what the younger generation is bringing forward.
I mean, law as a field is quite conservative in many ways, and it's almost a technical thing. The way that law works, it tends to look backwards. So it looks backwards for precedent, and it's often quite slow to bring about change. It takes quite a bit to get legislation passed in Parliament, things like that. So law itself as a profession is often quite conservative. It's a profession that is made up of people who often are of a particular class or social group, and that makes it harder for ideas to penetrate. And law in the way it works is not always as responsive as we would want it to be.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really interesting is that younger generations activist groups have been able to bring about changes in the law through protest and through trying to find ways to exert influence. But that takes time. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
It feels like the young generation is very impatient that we kind of, because we think it's fine. So we're like, wow, it should just be automatic as such. But in reality, it's more complex.
It is. And often it's the case, and lawyers would hate the fact that I'm saying this, but sometimes law isn't always the best tool for bringing about change.
No.
I've been reading with my students just this term a case about a trans man who gave birth and wanted to be recognized as the child's father on the birth certificate. You remember this case?
Yeah.
And it's kind of it's a really sad case to read, because what the sense that I got certainly in reading this case was that the judge was very sympathetic to the trans man's situation and to the child's situation. But there was no way that the judge could read or interpret the law that would allow the outcome that the trans man wanted. The law just couldn't be read or understood in the way that was needed to give the outcome that I would say was kind of the most fair outcome. And sometimes that kind of shows the limitations of the law. We think that the law is this kind of all-powerful overarching force, but actually it can be a bit slow, it can be creaky, it's only as good as the people who interpret and enforce it. So it's an important method for protecting people, but it is not a be-all and end-all method for achieving change, for sure.
What also compelled you to start studying this?
How did I start studying this?
Yeah, what intrigued you? What made you want to look at?
Great question.
Between gender, sexuality, and then involvement with political.
So, more years ago than I like to think about, I was doing a master's in human rights at the LSE. At the same time, I was working in a drag bar in Camden and going out and partying in all of the kind of women's, lesbian, queer scenes in London. And there was a real almost disjuncture between these different aspects of my life. I was studying human rights at the LSE and kind of learning this very kind of formal way of understanding rights, of understanding law. And then I was living in this world that was fluid, changing, complicated, had all sorts of people in all sorts of different situations. And the more that I thought about the way that people talked about human rights, the more I thought this doesn't really map on to my understanding of my community's history and way of being. And I wanted to look at that gap. I wanted to look at the fact that LGBT rights, as they'd kind of been presented in this master's, and it was only a tiny, tiny bit of what I looked at, didn't capture the totality of what it means to be queer or gender non-conforming or LGBT, any of those kind of words or phrases that we use to describe the community. And that fascinated me. And the first thing I sort of looked at was, is there any way that we can think about rights differently? Can we think about rights in a more fluid way? Can we think about rights in a way that lends itself to capturing this complexity? And kind of gave up on that idea. And then I thought, is there a way we can think about identity that would make it fit with rights? And that definitely doesn't work. So in the end, I found I just had to get comfortable with imperfection, get comfortable with the fact that law, gender, and sexuality need each other, but don't always sit comfortably with each other. And sometimes what we need to do is sit in those grey spaces and those uncomfortable spaces and work out what's going on there, or work out what we might do differently, even if it's never going to be a perfect solution. And that's what I've been doing for pretty much my whole career.
Oh, amazing. So as you know as well, so the project that I'm doing at the minute is looking at gender and androgyny. I was having this very interesting conversation because there's and I don't want to say old, but a more mature student doing masters with me, and she questioned to me, because she knew about androgyny and non-binary, but she got confused between the two of them. And I was trying to say that they are different, but when I was trying to describe it, I couldn't get it across quite accurately.
So I think that's a really interesting question, because, well, I'll come to why I think it's really interesting. We could say very simply, non-binary could be understood as a term that refers to any gender identity that isn't male or female. Yeah. So we could start with that really simple connection between non-binary and gender identity. Now, androgyny, or being androgynous, it's really interesting because it's a very old term. Yeah. Now, if we think about androgyny in the sense that it's currently used, or one sense that androgyny is currently used, we could think of androgyny as a sort of outward appearance of having an indeterminate gender. So we could link androgyny with forms of gender expression, and with the expression of gender in a way that generally shows kind of generally expresses gender in an indeterminate way, or depending on how far back you go, as a kind of combination of masculine and feminine traits. One way to maybe separate out the distinction between non-binary and androgyny is to be very clear about the fact that some non-binary people may choose to express themselves androgynously. They may choose to outwardly portray their gender expression through a combination of masculine and feminine traits, or through kind of indeterminate gender traits.
Yes,
but non-binary people don't have to express their identity in that way. Non-binary doesn't have to be displayed as androgyny, because it is a part of one's identity. So it also includes how you understand and feel and experience your own identity and gender.
Yeah, because I know someone from the village who's non-binary, and so they love their beard, they love their facial hair.
Yeah.
But at the same time, any chance they get, they're literally running down Canal Street in a skirt or whatever. I just think it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it kind of goes to, one of the things I love about what I do is that I have come to learn and know and appreciate and celebrate the fact that there will always be more expressions and forms of and understandings of gender and sexuality than we can find words for. In so many ways, we are trying to put words on things that are far too complicated to capture in words. We are constantly finding new ways to be and think and love and understand ourselves. And that's one of the great things about this kind of conversation, but about the wider conversations, or wider just ways of being on Canal Street, where you can run down the street in a skirt with your beard, and that's brilliant and wonderful, rather than something that is condemned.
Because these conversations, I love having them with people, but I struggle to articulate sentences properly. So like when we get into like the bigger conversations, that's where I start struggling. And then every time I always feel like, oh, I don't know about this. And I'm like, I'm learning new stuff. But at the same time, I'm like, I can't express properly in words about it. Which I think interesting.
I think it's really interesting. And I think we need to be really careful in queer and gender non-conforming communities not to gatekeep, because the tendency, and you see it in queer history, is to find a kind of being or a set of words that suits yourself, and then you create a little kind of barrier around your group and your people, and that creates kind of divisions from other people who might be gender non-conforming or have sexual orientations that don't match yours, but they're still not heterosexual or are expressing themselves in non-normative ways. So I think it is a constant process of sort of being kind and being humble with each other, and recognizing that nobody has all the answers. We're all constantly exploring these really, really complicated things that are often beyond words, and just trying to find the best form of words to deal with that. And being gentle with each other can really help.
Yeah. So I've always, my attitude has always been like, whatever you identify as, good for, like happy for you, because you've explored yourself, you're happy, and as long as other people are happy, then like it shouldn't affect other people. This is why I get really annoyed with things with gender and that, when it's debating rights from people, and it's just like, but if they're happy, why is it bothering you so much when this other person completely living unaffected by you?
If I could answer that question fully, I think I would Yeah, I'd probably be able to apply for promotion to professor right now. It's a really, really big issue and a really complicated question. One of the things that I have found in my research is the importance of gender and sexuality to a number of other really fundamental ideas. So there are international relations scholars who write about the relationship between gender and the state. Um, and this might seem like quite an out there idea, but certainly going right back to sort of the colonial encounter and the colonial period, there were gendered, I'm not even going to say undertones, overtones of the way in which states interacted with each other. There was this real sense during the colonial period of sort of these Victorian British colonizers presenting themselves as masculine and rational and all of that thing, and going out to the rest of the world, which they considered to be feminine and irrational, and therefore in need of conquering and leading and guiding. And it became this kind of civilizing mission that justified a massive amount of brutality. And all of it depended on this underpinning gender binary. And that gender binary wasn't sort of fully expressed. But if you read a lot of the language, there's a huge amount of anxiety about gender and anxiety about really strictly monitoring the boundaries of gender within that language. And I don't think that tendency has gone away in modern times. There are connections between gender and how we understand how the state works, or how we understand how family works, or how family relations work, or even how we understand how religion works. So when you're talking about gender, you're also talking about things that are sort of fundamental to the structures of how people organize their lives. And once you start to pull at the thread of gender and say, well, perhaps it could be more than this.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's more going on. You're not just pulling at that thread of gender, you're pulling at the thread of all sorts of other institutions that give people stability and security. And that can be scary. And when people are scared, they don't tend to listen as well and may even lash out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously you're more experienced and more knowledge than me. So I was just wondering, with people, like with people challenging the gender norms becoming more prevalent, I would say recently in like modern times. Like, how would you compare it to like a few decades ago, like in the 80s or the 90s? Because obviously you have like these pop icons from the 80s who were very androgynous as such.
It's a great question. It's a great way to think about it. I mean, to say that, as you say, to say that people weren't challenging gender norms in the 80s and 90s is to ignore David Bowie, or to ignore, for example, the fashion of the 1990s. I mean, I grew up then and everything was androgynous heroin chic. I found a quote today from a fashion magazine that talked about the dead from the neck down 90s androgyny, which has become one of the defining properties of female beauty, sported in all fashion magazines and appropriated by actors, models, and superstars. Androgyny conveniently trades in ambiguity, blurs and confuses boundaries, and turns heterosexual presumption on its head. So it's not like these ideas weren't circulating in the 80s and 90s. I guess there's big questions to be asked about the difference between fashion and music, and then the way people live their lives and experience gender norms. I mean, you might have fashion heroin chic and then sort of suburban living where there's very clear expectations of gendered norms. So to say that there was one way of being in the 80s and 90s is to miss the kind of different layers and levels of how people lived and experienced gender. You could also say that in many places, those who challenged gender norms were very marginalized. And that's not to say people who challenge gender norms aren't marginalized now, but I'm thinking of, for example, perhaps the Vogue ball scene in New York, and the way in which this was a very underground scene, and one that grew out of essentially people not having the support of traditional structures like family, like the state, and people challenged gender norms and created their own communities by which they supported each other and explored that. Yeah, chosen families for sure. I think it's also worth thinking even longer term than the 80s and 90s. You know, Virginia Woolf was writing about androgyny. There are Platonic myths about androgyny. So it's always been a sense that is there. And there are many different cultures that have third genders or expressions of two-spiritedness, which go beyond kind of the gender boundaries that I think that we sort of think about in an Anglo-centric or Western sense. What might be slightly different now, perhaps, and I'm being cautious, is the idea that we at least have some legal protections that are in place in sort of the 2000s. So, you know, LGBT and queer people have been using human rights law for a long time to try and fight for rights, but we had a raft of measures that came in sort of 1998, 2006, 2010 that brought in protections around equality, around anti-discrimination, that kind of thing. And that perhaps creates a little bit more space, but I'd be really cautious of saying that the law is a panacea for creating the kind of circumstances where people can, you know, can express whatever gender identity suits them, or whatever gender identity they are most comfortable with, and expect not to face harassment and discrimination. You know, it is a fact that in all countries of the world, non-normative gender expressions and non-normative expressions of sexuality puts people more at risk.
It does. So quite recently as well, it was mainly in Liverpool. I don't know if you saw it. There was quite a few hate crimes that were happening like every other week or every 2 weeks over the summer and that. Because I kept seeing loads of people, because on Instagram it's great because you just connect loads of different people in different cities, and everyone's stories every other week was of a different person that had been attacked. So I do agree with what you're saying about the law, being careful about saying about it, because in like no one's fully protected from being in the app. You still have these backward thinking people that don't agree with it and will take their beliefs to an extreme extent.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things to pull out there. I mean, it's the fact that one of the things that I think we've really failed at present is kind of saying, oh, well, we've got the Human Rights Act, we've got the Equality Act, we've even got gay marriage now, we've got the Gender Recognition Act, we've sorted LGBT rights, we're done now. And we haven't. And
so I had a discussion with my sisters because they're saying, well, you're legal to be married, you've got this law protecting you, there's no discrimination for you to face. And I was like, but the law doesn't change people's attitudes. People will still say stuff, people will still do things. And at the same time, I know it's not very likely, but the law is very temporary, I would say, because if you get an extremist person in power, there's nothing exactly stopping them. And if they have a large party, like house seating, nothing stops them from revoking or changing rights.
So true. I mean, if you'll permit me to be a bit lawyery for a second,
Yeah,
there
of
is
course.
talk in the papers this morning of changing or even repealing the Human Rights Act. Now, the Human Rights Act gives further effect to the European Convention on Human Rights in UK law. And one of the things that LGBT people have been able to do for a long time, since even before the Human Rights Act, was to use Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights to fight for, at first, for decriminalisation, but also for family life rights, for recognition of their identities. So the protection of human rights is incredibly important to LGBT people, particularly through this mechanism of the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. And to hear a politician saying, oh no, we're going to make massive changes to the Human Rights Act is quite scary as a queer person.
It is scary. So
Yeah.
when Brexit and all this was announced and all these things being, oh, we can make our own laws, I took a step back from that, and that made me panic a little, because I was like, well, you've got a very backwards thinking party in power at the minute that don't fully agree with ideals. Because if you look at, say, members like at the top, a lot of those ministers didn't vote for equal marriage; they voted against it.
Yeah, and it takes away another kind of international check or international protection. A lot of equalities law began at the EU level, particularly equalities law that protected well, not just sexual orientation and gender identity minorities, but protection around race, protection around religion. The influence for that came from EU directives and then was translated, I suppose, into UK law.
Yeah.
And it is a bit scary to think that that little extra check, that little extra kind of level of protection is taken away and is being further eroded with the kind of discussion that is taking place now. Not just around the Human Rights Act, but all sorts of other legislation that's going through now, the policing bill, and some of the measures in there will be harmful to huge numbers of people, but will make claiming asylum more difficult. And it's already very, very difficult to claim asylum on the basis of sexuality or gender identity. So this puts another potential hurdle for queer asylum seekers. There's all sorts of things. You know, we think that society progresses forward. You know, things get better and better and better and better. But actually, there's always the potential for measures coming in that could change things, that could make things worse, that could change our situations. And it's worth paying attention to that, and paying attention to wider issues, not just of sort of gender and sexuality, but of wider kind of social justice solidarities, and trying to pay attention to the interconnections between gender, sexuality, and other forms of seeking justice.
Yeah, because there was a lot of uproar because when Pride in London was announced that it was cancelled, that got announced a few days after the football during the summer, the England versus Italy match.
Yeah.
I remember seeing all those people crowded in London. Police didn't do anything or anything to enforce any of these like COVID acts that they're using to say that Pride in London should be cancelled because it's not obeying these COVID restrictions. But there was no enforcement of COVID restrictions then with football. So my social media was literally lit up with complaints and people outraged about them saying you can't have Pride in London because of that, but it's another rule for these people to celebrate a football match.
And it comes back to, you know, the law is only as good as the people who enforce it. And that's a real limitation of the law. And, you know, there are feminists, there are queer scholars who are very suspicious of law in general, and very suspicious of turning to law to kind of seek protections, because law is an institution of the state, and the state hasn't always been that kind to queer people.
No, it has not. And then the final thing I wanted to discuss with you is obviously we've talked about non-binary and androgynous kind of things with political people. But like honestly, I've mentioned it with my community, like my little bubble, people I know were all fully accepting of whatever. But is that, in your experience, has that always been the case with you? Obviously, that.
Good question. Because I have lived inside and outside of little bubbles. I think, to be honest, I'd go back to what we were talking about before. History echoes. So there have been times of greater acceptance and times of kind of drawing back. And sometimes that seems to reflect times of other instability. You know, when everything around us is chaos, people seek certainties, and that can sometimes mean that they turn against people who look different. What I would say is, you know, and this I'm sure there are so many people of about my age who have said it every single generation. The younger generation kind of give me hope. The kind of debates that I see happening, the kind of communities and conversations, my students and the way in which they engage with these ideas, it makes me really happy, and it gives me a bit of faith that there's some great people out there who are having really great conversations and thinking really big ideas. And that's not to say that everything that went before was sort of terrible or wrong. One of the things that I think we also need to do is remember our history. And I say that, you know, myself as someone who has a whole series of queer history that's gone before me. I think that it's really important to make these connections between what's gone before and what's coming now, not condemning the past for things that they didn't manage to do or things that they got wrong, and learning from what happened. And I see those kind of ideas illustrating the conversations that my students have. And despite everything that's going on, despite Brexit, despite attacks on the Human Rights Act, despite our current government, that gives me quite a lot of faith and quite a lot of happiness.